Welcome to Masha and the Bears, a monthly show where we discuss global affairs from a progressive internationalist perspective. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to like and subscribe, hit the bell, and I'd like to also let you know that Masha and the Bears is also a podcast that's released on Sunday evening. Today, we're switching gears a bit and talking about some major stories taking place in the world that are both surprising and controversial, and they're happening outside of the United States, but very much connected to the US empire. We're going to journey from Belarus to Poland and Hungary and all the way to Ethiopia. We're diving into migration crises, opposition politics and right-wing regimes, and civil war and its repercussions. For today's show, we have the all-star crew from This is a Revolution podcast with the great deep state Kuba. Welcome, Kuba. Oh, he's on his way. And the wonderful Pascal. I hope that both of them are going to join us in a moment. There they are. Welcome.
Welcome.
Awesome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you guys join our monthly discussion on these exciting topics. So for today's show, we each picked a story we found particularly fascinating and also somewhat disturbing. And we're going to begin in Belarus and the evolving border migration crisis that's taking place there. We're going to quickly see a video of how that's playing out in real life. And this is a fast developing crisis. And we're going to discuss what's happening there. And then we're going to move to Cuba and talk about Hungary and Poland. And finally, all the way to Ethiopia with Pascal. So let's start by playing clip one. Jason, if you could please play the Twitter clip on the border of Belarus. Oops. Okay, while we're waiting for the clip, perhaps we can just start with some context of what's happening. So some of you may have seen this story evolving, but I found this to be quite shocking, honestly, to see the videos of refugees being shuffled between the border of Poland and Belarus, but also Belarus shares the border with Lithuania and Latvia, and this migration crisis is much beyond Poland at this point, but there are thousands of troops now on the Polish border pushing these migrants back into Belarus, and Belarusian guards pushing them outwards, in some ways even inciting them to cut the wire fence. So it's really quite a dramatic crisis. Belarus is being blamed by the European Union for facilitating what they are discussing and describing as human trafficking. This idea that they're deliberately trafficking all these refugees from the Middle East. Some of them are Kurdish, some of them are coming from Afghanistan, from all over various countries that have experienced extreme trauma and war, trafficking them into Belarus, not with no intention to keep them there, and then pushing them outwards to Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. And from there, some of them also plan to move on to other European Union countries. Right now, as far as I've read the reports from today, 8 people have already died at the border due to freezing conditions. And the treatment that they're receiving is truly inhumane. And it's also showcasing this mix of, authoritarian politics, migration crisis, the fragility of European Union, and much more. It's really kind of a fascinating array of factors and events that's culminated in this one big crisis that's still going unresolved. So that's something that I want to start off with. I don't know if Pascal and Kuba, if you guys had a chance to read a little bit about this crisis, what were your initial thoughts? Were you surprised by it? How did you see the framing of Western media about what's happening? What kind of aspects did you find most troubling when you look at these images that we're going to see in a moment of this, refugees essentially stuck in between these countries that they're unfamiliar with in horrible conditions and with having no rights, no ways of protecting their humanity? Maybe we'll start with Cuba.
So for me, this is, of course, it hits close to home because I'm Polish by citizenship, by ethnicity, by birth, you name it, by impronounceable last name. Mm-hmm. And I'm also an immigrant, a refugee in Canada. That's how my family arrived here, and that's the basis on which we were let in. So these are people experiencing,
of course,
the same kind of dislocation that my family did, and they're, rather than being given services, being given a welcome, and being able to start a new life, they're being used as pawns in a political battle between Belarus and the European bloc. Mm-hmm. Putting aside my bleeding heart and my care for humanity and putting on my proper Darth Kuba deep state helmet, it makes perfect sense for Belarus to adapt this type of tactic. In weaponizing migrant flows and refugees, it's following the model that was very successfully developed by Turkey. You're outside of the EU, but still dependent on the EU for economic support, still subject to potential sanctions or
Oh my
other
God.
types of discipline by the EU bloc. Belarus by itself has very little leverage. Unlike Ukraine or Russia, it doesn't control energy supply into the EU or energy transit. The only leverage that it has is the credible threat of pushing more primarily Middle Eastern, primarily Muslim refugees and asylum seekers into the European Union, which has struggled both bureaucratically, but also politically, culturally, to find a way to cope with refugee flows from 2015, when over 1 million migrants were accepted into the core EU countries. It's remarkable that Belarus has managed to engineer this leverage, because none
Yes,
of
it's
the
incredible.
refugees, exactly, the human trafficking accusation has some merit. Nobody finds their way accidentally from
To Belarus.
Afghanistan
Yeah.
or Iraq into Belarus.
Yeah.
There has to be some kind of pipeline, some kind of network.
Yeah, that story
Bringing,
is just it's really hasn't been quite, at least as far as I know, hasn't been told as clearly of how did they actually make it through that pipeline, right? I mean, we hear about Belarus kind of, masterminding this whole idea, but how do they actually, how do they do that? Well, how does this whole trafficking network work? I heard that some of the Belarusian embassies are getting shut down. Some consulates are getting shut down in Iraq, I think in other countries. So there's some response to it from the region as well. But as far as who is actually doing it and how do they get these people to learn about Belarus, which is not on the map at all. It's not part of the European Union. It's been kind of a silent giant in Europe, often described as the last dictatorship of Europe. How do they manage to get there? It's kind of struck me by surprise.
it's funny, you have to have a Canada-style immigrant and refugee outreach and branding program with all the resources that that takes. But then with the end result that, no, we're just going to dump you into Europe. And the Europeans haven't even agreed to take you. So, get used to living in the no man's land between two surly Slavic countries that
Yeah.
neither of whom wants you. For the Poles, the quite apart from the current crisis, in 2015, the conservative nationalist government of Poland demonstrated and communicated unequivocally that Muslims are not welcome, that refugees, no matter how well grounded and justifiable their asylum claims, Poland is not interested in taking in groups that it considers to be hostile or unassimilable. And this is part and parcel with the governing ideology of the Law and Justice Party, which is a Polish ethno-nationalism with very strong Catholic, Christian, traditionalist elements, and a very aggressive resistance to the human rights justifications, the human rights legitimacy program of the European Union, and the very idea of cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism, which has been forwarded in countries like Germany and France, and is in a very controversial and uncertain way in Eastern European countries, apart from the pressure that the EU can mount against those governments. That type of program is just a non-starter. In fact, it's a useful tool for these nationalist parties to use as a foil, as an external boogeyman to shore up their support. If you don't elect us, if you don't go with us, the true defenders of Christendom, the true bulwark of the nation, then we're going to get overrun by the Muslim hordes with the connivance of the effeminate Eurocrat multiculturalists in Brussels.
So we're going to get to this. We're going to get to Poland's struggles, domestic struggles next, in terms of the opposition movement that's planning out there and what frictions this kind of migration crisis is bringing into this dynamic. But I know that Jason has actually got the clip ready for us. So let's play the clip just to kind of visualize what's happening on the border and then turn to Pascal next. Okay, so this was a very brief clip, but there are many others. If the viewers are interested, there's many others that are even more
The audio itself is very evocative. One thing that viewers should understand is that winter is coming. On the Poland-Belarus border, that's a serious matter. People will die from the cold and exposure.
We didn't hear you for a moment there, Kuba, but what were you saying about what they were? There were certain sounds.
Yeah, the sounds are very evocative, and you can hear the voices of soldiers and the voices of refugees, of women, like crying out. Pain, fear, and the one thing that's important to recognize is that winter is coming, and it's the border between Poland and Belarus. It's not the U.S.-Mexico border. It's not the Turkish-Greek border. This is an area where winter conditions are lethal, and there is no infrastructure in place for these refugees.
Yeah, there's nothing in place for them
to stay. Exactly. Right now, they're getting by with winter coats and whatever supplies they can muster, but they're sleeping rough. At best,
there are many children. If you look at the pictures, there are many images of small children wrapped up in blankets and jackets, and it's just really,
which again,
heart-wrenching images. Yeah.
And which again suggests that they were flown in, right? That it's it might be plausible for a family to walk from Syria through Turkey to the border of the EU at Bulgaria or Greece, but nobody is taking their family on a hike through the Caucasus Mountains. And then
it looks like it was more
Chechnya.
Direct, right? There was a more of a direct route. Yeah. Pascal, I just wanted to turn to you here. What did you think about this whole crisis?
What is more disconcerting for me about this is in terms of how it plays out for the larger geopolitical forces, not only in the area, but in the world, because now, from what I've read, the EU is officially supporting Poland in terms of this conflict with Belarus. And right now, I'm actually reading that the Soviet Union is dispatching nuclear-capable strategic bombers to patrol the Belarusian border right now.
The European Union or NATO?
No, the Russians are dispatching.
The Russians.
Yes. So the Russians
they're
are
involved as well.
They're basically they're involved, and they're basically claiming that they are in the interest of their ally, quote unquote, Belarus, which is interesting because we've known that the leader of Belarus has had a kind of hot and cold relationship with Russia for the last 2 years. And there have been rumors recently within the last years that the United States was interested in some kind of quote unquote destabilization effort in Belarus. So I'm not necessarily sure if that's totally true, but if it is, this could give the opportunity for some type of destabilization effort to continue on behalf of the U.S. But it seems like the EU and I think NATO are siding with Poland in this conflict. So my major question and concern is that with the Russians already deploying nuclear strategic, armaments on the Polish border, which sounds pretty serious to me, are we looking at something that may actually develop into a serious type of conflagration between the NATO-EU side of the faction as well as the Russian side of the faction?
I for one, highly doubt it. The destabilization event, they took their shot at Lukashenko and they missed. There were, around the last elections, there was a groundswell, a legitimate local opposition against Lukashenko, who's been around for a very long time. and has not governed well or respected the rights of Belarusians. And the EU and the US, just like with the Maidan protests, sought to instrumentalize that as a regime change tactic, and it didn't go anywhere. With some support from Russia, not overwhelming support, not decisive support, but with some support from Russia, Lukashenko was able to crush the threat to his continued rule. And now this is his revenge. This is how he gets at the EU, both economically and politically, but also undercuts their ideological posturing against him. If he's a dictator, if he's such a bad dictator, if the Europeans care so much about human rights, why aren't you letting these people in?
Yeah, today I was actually looking at some Russian-speaking websites in Lithuania, I believe, and some Baltic countries. They have a pretty large Russian-speaking population, and I was, intrigued by what they were reporting about the crisis. And there was actually a video blogger who has tons of followers, who was presenting exactly this argument that Kuba just mentioned, that this ideological kind of it's shaming, basically. So he was actually bringing us back to the crisis in Italy, and the former Italian politician, the right-wing politician, going to jail for his treatment of the migrants coming and drowning on the ship. And he was saying, well, actually, Lukashenko deserves a medal for saving, these migrants. He actually deserves a human rights medal, and we need to be parading around him, and he should be in all kinds of movies and, red carpet parades. And Europe is, Europeans should be ashamed, including all these various politicians, the head of the European Commission. They're the ones who are immoral, So he was really kind of, striking this morality battle, like who is moral
And yet,
here. So
how many of these asylum seekers have been resettled in Belarus?
well, probably close to none, I'm guessing.
And there you go. I mean, that's the entirety of Lukashenko's moral case.
Right.
Evaporates.
Yeah.
And it's clearly just the weaponization of human misery against governments that are that like to talk big on human rights and compassion, but that have the same real political and domestic constraints on what they can actually do for foreign asylum seekers. And part of this is an EU own goal. If you trumpet human rights as the cornerstone of your international legitimacy, then you've painted yourself into a corner. You either need to accept that there's going to be significant cost to honor those rights and accept people and make that challenging and potentially unsuccessful effort of welcoming and assimilating hundreds of thousands, millions of migrants from war zones across the region, or basically shut up about how great human rights are, because right now there's the very strong perception that human rights are a Western privilege that gets protected for certain classes and certain categories of Westerner, and for everybody else it's humanistic poetry without any substance to it.
It was actually interesting to see, like in the news itself, the coverage rarely talks about, where those individuals, those groups are coming from, what their various, traumas and circumstances are that led them to this particular desperate move to go through Belarus, a country they probably haven't heard that much about before, being smuggled through this whole route. So we just don't hear a lot about those stories. And the way that people are referred to who are stuck on this border are also referred to as migrants, but in reality, one would say they're refugees, right? They're seeking asylum. They're desperate to immigrate. They're not just migrating, because when you think about migrants, it's often a reference to labor migrants, people who have choices. It's not like that makes things always better, but they have certain choices to leverage as opposed to having no choice at all.
Or what they're escaping is poverty or economic conditions rather than the imminent threat of violence. But one thing that also needs to be said is the migrants themselves, there's no shortage of desperate people in extremis that need refuge and that are willing to take extreme risks in order to arrive at a place of safety. However, there's also people who are opportunistic in their in taking advantage of the perception, right? The promise, the idea that you can find a better life in Europe. And there's, within the EU asylum system, there was a mechanism to distribute migrants across the European Union so that not everyone ended up in the most generous and most economically dynamic countries and most prosperous countries like Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, France. The migrants that were distributed to peripheral countries, places like Poland, places like Slovakia, many of them left immediately when they could to go back to the core.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to judge people for, in desperate situations, trying to find the most likely opportunity, the most likely strategy to get to a place where they can have some security and have some prosperity. But the asylum system itself is liable to pressure and violation by all parties. It's not a good system, and you have a fear on the part of the EU that knows about the holes in its own asylum system. That once somebody arrives and applies, regardless of who they are and regardless of whether or not their case has any merit, it is extraordinarily difficult to get rid of them. There are cases where dangerous people come in under the pretext of seeking asylum and then cannot be removed because their criminal record in their home country would subject them to the potential of capital punishment, which prevents repatriation by the EU.
Mm-hmm.
So that is not characteristic of the migrants as a whole. I'm not repeating the Trump line, but
I was getting a little worried there, you know?
no. It's the entire system
Sure.
is broken, and what countries should be doing is reaching out to displaced persons camps in countries like Turkey, domestic displaced people in Iraq and Syria, and filling their refugee quotas and and taking as many asylum seekers from the site as possible,
Mm-hmm.
rather than creating an incentive for human traffickers like the government of Belarus or criminal human traffickers operating for profit to move vulnerable people to unorganized international borders where they're subject to this type of pressure, this type of exploitation, this type of blackmail between different regional powers.
Right. I mean, the whole system needs major reform, but given how sensitive the crisis, or just even the issue of migration is in Europe, it seems that it's unlikely that there will be systemic changes anytime soon. In the meantime, people go helpless on the border.
And the system, we'll talk about this with Poland and Hungary, but the only systemic changes that are likely are unmitigated hardening.
Right, exactly. Not the other way around, where you actually find systems to not soften, but become more acceptable of certain groups, and then as a result, maybe not make it possible for Belarusian regime to even engage in such action. But that seems unlikely. But we're almost to the middle of our time, so I want us to keep it moving to other topics. This topic is going to stay on in our discussion. We're going to stay with Poland and also Hungary. That's our second theme today, and it's about not so much migration per se. The bad boys of Europe. We're continuing with that theme. We started with the worst boy of Belarus and then moving on to Poland and Hungary, where there's some interesting tribulations, maybe some winds of change when it comes to some opposition movements, new elections coming up in Hungary, but also all kinds of frictions taking place vis-a-vis European Union and about just what the society looks like when it comes to liberal versus conservative winds of change in Poland. So maybe we can play the next clip about Poland if Jason is able to load it up. It would be great to see the protests taking place in Poland in the past few weeks or the past very recent events. Can we play that clip on Poland?
Give me a second. It's moving really slow.
Okay, maybe we can start. We can start the discussion because we don't know how long it will be to load up the video. But maybe Kuba, you can just tell us a little bit briefly about why you picked those stories, because there's so many stories and all of us picked each one. So mine was the border crisis, but you picked this particular story of Poland and Hungary. And I see that Jason actually does have the video now. So let's briefly see the video and we can get to the discussion.
To jest ciche wyprowadzenie Polski z Unii Europejskiej. 17 lat temu my, jako społeczeństwo, powiedzieliśmy w referendum, że jesteśmy za tym, żeby być w Unii. Mam dosyć deptania naszych wartości wspólnych i tym, co robi obecny rząd. To jest mój symbol, który pokazuje, że jestem Europejczykiem, jestem także Polakiem, ale i Europejczykiem.
I can understand a little bit from my Russian background, but not everything. It's always been kind of a mysterious language to me. So what are some of the key slogans that we're hearing from this video, Kuba?
So the chanting is "We are European, Poland is European," and the gentleman interviewed argues that the brinksmanship that the law and justice government is playing with the European Union is a kind of stealth polexit, a stealth withdrawal from the EU, and that the reason that it needs to be done this way is that the European project is enormously popular in Poland. Polish people have benefited greatly from EU membership.
And by enormously popular, what do you mean? Is it like majority? Is it like
70-80% of Poles?
That's very high. Yeah.
Yes.
European.
Overwhelming. Exactly. Support support Polish membership in the Union.
Yeah.
European Union. It's funny because if you ask them, do you like the European Union? It's going to be closer to 50-50. But more than half of the people who don't like the European Union want to stay in it.
And why is that?
Freedom of travel, freedom of work across the continent, as well as the equalization payments and the investments that are made by Brussels in Poland. There's a solidarity program within the EU, Regional Development Fund, they call it, that takes excess, or it basically, wealthy countries pay in more and poorer countries receive greater investments, grants, financing for different programs. Poland also has benefited tremendously from the Common Agricultural Program. The implementation was meant to destroy Polish small farming, which remains a significant component of the Polish economy. But thanks to the Polish Polskie Stronnictwo Ludowe, the Polish People's Party, Polish Peasants Party, something like that.
Ludawida is people?
Lud is people.
Yeah.
And they're actually a successor party from the People's Republic period. As a socialist agricultural party, they were tolerated by the People's Republic of Poland and represented in government and politics during that period. They successfully mobilized small holding farmers throughout Poland to take advantage of European programs, modernize and adapt to European markets. And Poland remains a significant agricultural producer with subsidies coming in from Brussels to pay for that agriculture. So economically,
so it's mainly economic, right? The economic and pragmatic benefits. Because I've read the recent study as well, how there's this kind of affinity towards neoliberalism in economic terms amongst countries like Poland, right? But at the same time, there's this combination of conservatism when it comes to, moral, political values, cultural values. So being able to combine those two forces is something that the EU did not anticipate, this idea of combining the two.
But that's the thing. The Law and Justice Party, and to a large extent, the Fidesz party, Viktor Orban, leftists should be more concerned because they are not neoliberal nationalists. They are nationalists, socialists in that they like government intervention in the economy. They are unapologetic in offering social payments for families or for agriculture or for other favored sectors. They are not neoliberals. They don't want to sell off everything. They don't want to just invite the corporations in. And that type of nationalism, that type of ethno-nationalism, religious traditionalism, and economic populism is the political culture of 50% of Poles. The good thing is that it's only 50%. It's 70%
Pascal,
in Hungary.
do you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to interject because from what my reading is that the relationship between Viktor Orban in Hungary and the factions of Poles who are more nationalistic, who actually don't like the EU, is very, very strong. And one of the issues that people are concerned about is basically there was a, I don't know what the name is for the Polish Supreme Court, a high court ruling in Poland that was basically deciding on the ability of laws being legislated from the EU to be recognized within the actual nation state of Poland. And the court basically ruled that these laws should not apply. And there was a strong faction of people within Poland who were like, good, because we want to maintain our own integrity over our sovereignty as a nation. So I don't disagree with Kuba, because if he's Polish, he knows Poland better than I do. But there are, for materialist purposes, a large number of Poles who get benefit from being in the EU as a more inexpensive country, because they're not leveraged with the significant weight of tariffs and other things that normal other countries in the EU normally are hit with, i.e. why Britain decided to break away from the EU. But the Polexit concept, I don't think it's something that's this kind of airy-fairy kind of fantasy talk. I think that Orban has been able to mobilize, with his good reputation with those faction of Poles in the country, enough Poles who are now seemingly quite animated with the concept of Poland leaving the European Union.
The idea of leaving the European Union is not attractive. The idea of pushing back against Brussels, it's a little like red states in the U.S. that love to trash Washington, but also love military spending in state. The boogeymen are all cultural. LGBT rights especially, but also immigration, asylum seekers, secularism, and the balance against the traditionalist, nationalist, populist force comes from neoliberals rather than the left. The left is extraordinarily weak in Poland and in Hungary, and it's people like Donald Tusk, former Polish Prime Minister, former EU Commissioner, that is the potential savior of Polish democracy and Poland's place in the EU. And he comes from the neoliberal Civic Platform Party, which wouldn't mind immigration, wouldn't mind taking more asylum seekers, but is also set against any type of redistributive programs within the economy or interference on corporate autonomy within the EU. And the sad thing is that that's the choice. In Hungary, it's been formalized with all opposition parties, including the people who are more fascist than Orban, siding together to back a single candidate against Fidesz. In Poland, it seems like that may take place with Donald Tusk being the standard bearer for the opposition, but he is a neoliberal. He is not a man of the left in anyone's imagination.
Well, this is what we're seeing in Hungary also, is that there's a new candidate or political figure who's actually posing a bit of a challenge to Orban in terms of popularity. Are any of you guys familiar with his platform? Is he a neoliberal?
Yeah.
Is he a nationalist?
I enjoyed reading the article that Kuba shared with us about some attacks on him through all these different media channels that are controlled by Viktor Orban, right, or his government, and all kinds of attacks claiming that he's gay, or all kinds of ways to kind of discredit him through more cultural, social norms. But it turns out, from what I read at least, that he seems quite conservative, right? He's religious. He's got 7 children. So he's kind of this family guy from a small town who hasn't been a big political figure before. So
Well-
maybe Kuba, do you know much about him? What's his story? And is he really a formidable force for change, or change against Orban at least?
So, because of the power of ethno-nationalism, religious conservatism in the political culture of both Poland and Hungary, there is a significant portion of the population that actually would like Orbanism or law and justice with a human face, right? Like, you guys are right about everything you say about the gays, and you guys are right that we shouldn't take any immigrants, but do you have to be so coarse about it? Do you have to be so belligerent? Can't we find a more civilized way to disagree with the Europeans and to play a more productive role? There's a Szymon Homulka, I think, is the Polish version of the same character. And his popularity in Hungary is an artifact of the pooling of the entire opposition. He gets the people who basically want ethno-nationalism with a human face, peeling off some of the Fidesz support. And he also gets everyone else, whether leftists or neoliberals or socialists or even the Jobbik party, whose main gripe against Orban is that he's too nice to the Jews. In Poland, I think that something similar may happen with Donald Tusk, but he, rather than being this kind of nationalism light figure, is a straight up ideological neoliberal, very 1990s guy.
That doesn't sound too exciting.
One of the questions that I like
Yeah.
to have, because I've been reading about how the EU is trying to find, and it's open dialogue on trying to find ways to enact subterfuge against what they call the illiberal political leaders in Europe right now, which is basically the reactionary right that has basically had a wave of successes from Hungary going on to, I would even say, Great Britain. And I'm wondering if this figure in Hungary that's posting opposition to Orban is kind of coming out of that constellation. In other words, are they kind of manufacturing their own version of Trojan horses to undermine the reactionary right-wing development that we're seeing in Europe?
Well, the opposition is real, it's local, it's sizable. There are outside interests on both sides. The Rod Dreher and Tucker Carlson love Viktor Orban, and there is definitely a romance between Orbanism and right-wing tendencies in the West and in Russia. Similarly, the Donald Tusk is a former EU commissioner, right? Of course, the EU is going to
He has
put their
connections,
thumb
right,
on
with
the
all those
scale.
people. He's got
Exactly.
long-standing ties. Yeah,
They're friends, right? Like,
Right.
it's
and they believe in the
not
same
even
things. Yeah.
exactly. It's both an ideological and a personal affinity. So of course he's going to get support from the center, but none of it is manufactured. This cleavage between hard nationalists and typically an opposition that's neoliberal or we could call it classical liberal, sort of 19th century constitutionalism. That's the main battle of Eastern European political culture, and we're seeing it played out right now with support from outside groups based on what's useful and ideologically comfortable for them to do.
Right.
But none of it is
I just want
manufactured.
to read this super chat really quick for JB. Thank you,
Yeah.
JB, for the super chat.
Yes,
Please
thank
have
you.
Masha and the Bears on more than once a month. Maria is an excellent host, and these are great topics.
Oh, thank you so much. We're definitely working on being a more frequent appearance. It takes a lot of effort, so we're maybe moving into twice a month in the new year. So we're thinking about that, but we appreciate all the support and enthusiasm, and it's important to us.
Best chat.
Best chat.
And-
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And thank you, Left Reckoning.
Left
I for
Reckoning,
one
welcome on board.
welcome our Left Reckoning Raiders.
Spasibo, as we say in Russian. So we're going to shift to Ethiopia because we are, moving on, and we have so much to discuss. But Ethiopia is such a major crisis that I want us to have enough time to talk about it. And these topics will keep coming up in our future shows as well. I think the topic of this reckoning of different ideologies and elections and tensions in this so-called bad boys of Europe, we're not going to leave them alone. We're going to come back to them in our next episodes, as well as the migration crisis. But now I wanted to shift to Ethiopia, and if Jason is able to play the clip of the protest that took place in Addis Ababa just a few days ago, it would be great to see it and to talk about it. And Pascal is the one who picked the story, but the story of Ethiopia is very dear to my heart as well, because it's a country that I've been studying in relation to China, Chinese influence, and Russian and Soviet influence, but also I was looking at some American activities on the ground over the past few years, pre-pandemic. So I'm writing a book that focuses a lot on Ethiopia, and of course, now this crisis has been really all-encompassing, and so many of my friends are on different sides of this crisis in Ethiopia. Many people are unsafe. They're in the battlefield. They're stuck in their homes. They're scared. So it's really something that I feel very personal connection to, and at the same time, it's so messy and so complex and sometimes even confusing. So I'm excited to discuss some of these facets of this crisis, how it's been evolving with Pascal in Cuba. And Cuba also has been reading a lot and very experienced in the Horn of Africa region. So it'd be great to hear a little bit about regional dynamics at play there. So I don't know if Jason has the clip ready. If so, we can play it now and get into our discussion.
In Addis Ababa's Meskel Square, tens of thousands of protesters show their support for the Ethiopian government. Organized by the city's administration, it's also meant to lend support to the armed forces in their war against the Tigray rebels and their allies. Famous singer Tariku Gangisi was invited to sing in praise of Ethiopia.
I was told the battle was against my brother. I turned back. Let the young people not be sent. Instead, let's send our elders. Negotiation is better. With guns, we bring no solution. It's enough.
Okay, so this is just one of the many, right? Many different movements, protests. There's so much news coming out, and Pascal informed us just yesterday, right? There were UN officials, UN workers arrested or detained. I think 19
That's
of
correct.
them.
There
Is
were
that right?
16 UN workers who were actually Ethiopian nationals, but were workers for the UN who had been detained allegedly by the Ethiopian government. There's also an allegation that there were 70 USAID truck drivers that were also taken, who were supposed to be delivering aid to the Tigray region. What I find fascinating about the situation in Ethiopia is that there's a longer history than the reports of abuses of the Tigray people by the Ethiopian regime, which I don't doubt that was a reality. But we have to put that in the context of the fact that basically we must remember that the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, was governing Ethiopia from 1991 to 2018. And in that governance, they definitely governed with a significant kind of ethnic chauvinism that favored the Tigray people, who have cultural and historical ties to being the dominant tribe culturally in Ethiopia through the Christian religion. So one of the things we have to realize is that after the TPLF lost power in 2018, there was a coalition kind of government that was formulated, but because they were unwilling to basically give up their kind of overall hegemony over the political apparatus, what happens is that there was a popular uprising that removed them from power, and this is how President Abiy Ahmed gets into power as head of Ethiopia. From that point on, what happens is that in 2020, there was supposed to be an election that was supposed to be held to determine who would lead the country. Because of COVID-19, the Ethiopian government decided to delay the election. As a result of delaying the election, the TPLF basically took arms and started to basically rebel against the Ethiopian government. Now, there were allegations, and I think there might be some truth to that, that in the conflagration between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, that there were abuses that were done to Tigrayan people in the Tigrayan region or other parts of Ethiopia. I think that's very possible. But we also have to realize that in the time of this conflagration, there's also been a displacement of 2 million people in the Amhara region and another region of Ethiopia as well that was populated by people who were not Tigrayan. So there's kind of been an abuse on both sides here, but because the Western world is very interested in demonizing the Ethiopian government of the current moment, there has not been much discussion on the abuses of the TPLF, because we must remember that between 1991 and 2018, when the TPLF was ruling Ethiopia, particularly in its war with Eritrea, they were considered allies of the U.S. So in all of this discussion in terms of the back and forth of what's going on with the Ethiopian government and TPLF, I've discovered something that I think that is actually a larger precipitating reason as to why this is going on that very few people are talking about. I think that a lot of this has to do with Egypt. If people are not aware, the Great Renaissance Dam is a dam project that the Ethiopians have been trying to take and put in power to dam up the Nile River to help them get independent electricity. The Egyptians, who are heavily dependent on the flow of the Nile River, have not been supportive of this. Neither have the Sudanese. What has been demonstrated by a report that I found in a Turkish news source, Egypt working to destabilize Ethiopia and East Africa, that there's evidence that the Ethiopian government is actually funding and sending weaponry to some of the destabilizing forces in the TPLF and other tribal, other ethnic factions in the region, in order to protect its actual position in destabilizing the effort to make the Ethiopian dam project viable. And they're also trying to coax the Sudanese to get involved with the project as well. There's also rumors that Egypt is interested in destabilizing aspects of Somalia to reassert its place as a hegemonic force in the Horn of Africa and countries to its south, because it has been displaced and that role has been moved to the Gulf regions and countries like Turkey. So I think that one of the things I find fascinating that few people are talking about is the role of Egypt in perhaps arming and financing the TPLF in order to help destabilize Ethiopia overall, to basically threaten the capacity of the Ethiopian Great Renaissance Dam project from being able to develop. So I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts on that.
So Kuba, I wanted to bring you back in. I don't see you for some reason on the screen, but I know you're there. Maybe the deep state. To bring Kuba back, because he's been talking about the dynamics of the Horn of Africa and the various external powers in relation to Ethiopia, the neighboring powers. What do you think about Pascal's claim about Egypt? Do you think that there is truth to the idea of funding TPLF, but also what about other powers? How are they involved in this conflict? Of course, Eritrea is one of them, obviously, but what about the rest? And why such animosity towards the US, right? The US has been kind of the center of this protest. What's happening there with regards to all these other powers participating in this conflict? It's not just Ethiopia, of course. So what do you think?
I think that Pascal has it correct, that he's absolutely right, that the significant gains from the destabilization of Ethiopia, and it gains on an issue which is of existential importance to it, which is Nile River water. They've been the Great Ethiopia Renaissance Dam has been under construction for well over a decade, and they all saw this day coming. In terms of one day it'll be completed, and one day the Ethiopians will have that leverage, the ability to control the flow of water downstream and impact Egypt in a fundamental way, potentially starve it economically, potentially starve it literally. And there's been a complete failure of regional coordination around the question of Nile River water. There's been conferences, some convened with the United States participating, others just including the regional countries, where Egypt has staked out a maximalist position, insisting on its rights according to antiquated colonial era treaties in which Ethiopia wasn't even a party, to a dominant share of Egyptian Nile River water. And Ethiopia has been calling that bluff by simply continuing the project and refusing to entertain the idea of an Egyptian veto. Finally, Egypt has seized an opportunity to assert that it is more than a paper tiger, that it can hurt Ethiopia, that it hurt Ethiopia seriously, as a means of potentially negotiating a deal or making the construction of the dam a moot point by making conditions impossible, governance in Ethiopia impossible to actually operate the project. And when it comes to Somalia is another way, because the Ogaden Desert is the borderland between Ethiopia and Somalia. There's populations, large ethnic populations that straddle the border. So Ethiopia is a significant pressure point that could be leveraged against Ethiopia, especially an Ethiopia which is struggling to maintain its territorial integrity and the governance of its territory. And I think for Egypt, this is a full court press. It's all or nothing. If the dam becomes operational and Ethiopia can control how much Nile water reaches Egypt, then essentially Egypt's days of exercising any meaningful sovereignty are over.
Well, what's
And
interesting also, sorry to interrupt you, Kuba, is
No,
that
please.
I was reading an article in a source from a 2015 article that was saying that in that particular stage of the dam, the TPLF was still in control of Ethiopia at the time. That they were negotiating with the TPLF. The Egyptians were saying, "Okay, build the dam, but give us a certain voice in terms of how the water is distributed." And it seemed, according to the article I read, that the TPLF was very much willing to do that. So that because the TPLF at that time in 2015 was playing a very, very shrewd game. They were using the building of the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam as a way to build nationalism in the consciousness of the people who were not their tribal faction, the Amhara and the other, the Amoro and what have you. But at the same time, because they were going to get, concessions from the Egyptians, whether money, arms, or support, or other forms of succor, they actually were going to cut the Egyptians into the capacity to actually maintain decision-making power over how the water is allocated. And what's fascinating is that once the Ethiopians, obviously the TPLF came out of power, now we have Ahmed is in power now. The question becomes that if the project is going to be finished on Ahmed's terms as the governing power in Ethiopia, then the Egyptians lose out on that possible, chip that they had in the bargain that would give them the ability to control how the water flows. So it would make sense logically that in this conflagration between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government, that Egypt could be actually supporting the TPLF, not only with money, but possibly weapons as well to destabilize them. Now, apparently, the United States is not siding with the Ethiopian government. They're siding with the TPLF. We know that Egypt is an ally of the U.S., definitely with Sisi, who's in charge of Egypt right now, the hardliner who took out the Muslim Brotherhood leader who recently died, as a matter of fact, who won in an election. So Sisi is the dictator in charge in Egypt right now. He's an American ally. He's also in the pockets of the Saudis as well. The Turks don't seem to have a problem with him. So it seems to me that in order to maintain the continuity from the pre-2018 period, where the U.S. was working with the TPLF, who was very willing to be a hostile force against Eritrea. Eritrea is one of those countries that does not do business with the EU or the UN or on U.S. terms whatsoever. And also, as a matter of fact, the TPLF was, from what I'm reading, also willing to work with Saudi Arabia in its issues with Yemen. So the TPLF is very willing to be kind of a tool of empire in the region, while Ethiopia, with its attempts at economic self-determination and becoming less dependent on foreign aid and foreign powers.
I just want to interject here a little bit in terms of the siding with the U.S. siding with Tigray or with TPLF. I mean, U.S. was very supportive of Abiy Ahmed actually for quite some time when he came to power. So, from country observing these events and talking to U.S. officials, they were very excited, almost ecstatic about Abiy Ahmed as a leader. And Abiy was turning Ethiopia also into, allegedly more democratic country. There were all kinds of releases of prisoners and journalists. And he was actually talking about creating more alliances as well, because under TPLF, there was a significant alliance with China, not alliance in formal terms, but significantly strong relationship. And many TPLF officials have been trained in China over and over. And right now, China is also very nuanced and balanced in how it's presenting its own position vis-a-vis, this whole crisis, saying that they're against sanctions, right?
That's right. Let's remember that Abiy
Yeah.
Ahmed is a Nobel Prize winner. He didn't get that Nobel Prize for nothing. So what that tells me, if he's a Nobel Prize winner, he was clearly very close, much embedded with the West at some point.
Right.
So the question becomes, but we also realize that we're in a situation right now as a consequence of this civil war. The U.S. is now talking about sanctions against Ahmed and Ahmed's government in Ethiopia, and it's much more heavy-handed with its language on the Ethiopian side than it is on the Tigrayan side by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, I think that a big question when it comes to which factions or governments or political movements the West, and especially the United States, supports is, well, one, there's capability. Like, are you actually governing the territory? Are you able to meaningfully implement the policies that you forward? Because what good is a puppet if they can't actually do anything?
Exactly.
Yeah. And as long as Ahmed seemed like he was capable of governing Ethiopia, he was an attractive figure.
Mm-hmm.
The Egypt coalition, they have a different interest. They don't need a puppet that can govern Ethiopia, because their preference, if they can't cut a deal, is there's no Ethiopia. Let's burn it down. That's better than having a capable government that is not going to do a deal on Nile water. And at this point, once the civil war starts, well, that's a failing grade for the government's ability to maintain control. And countries like the United States that had previously supported what seemed like a capable local agent have to reassess and see who's going to win, who's going to come out on top, because that's where you need to curry influence and favor.
Lots of different evolving dynamics, and of course also very different information universes that many of these commentators are existing in. If you go on Twitter and you look at different Ethiopian commentators from different ethnic groups and different positions arguing completely different things, and a lot of these debates also involve Western media, some accusing Western media of over dramatizing some of these events. I've seen quite a bit of discussion of recent CNN coverage saying that the new coalition is no longer just TPLF, but the coalition that's also kind of questionable how legitimate some of these other partners of parties are, that they're basically on the ground, almost approaching the capital, like kind of at the gate. They're about to storm the capital. And as many commented that actually this is not the case, and there's nobody yet storming the capital. Things are not as drastic as they are, accusing CNN of fake news. So lots of kind of discussions that also involve Western media and whether or not it's telling the real story, the balanced story. And there's so many stories to tell about Ethiopia, so many different stories from Pascal's really astute observations about Egypt, to all kinds of other dynamics within Ethiopia itself, the long history of TPLF, but also the different other groups that are competing for influence, and of course major human rights violations on both sides. There's so many that have been uncovered by various observing bodies. So a lot going on, a very tragic story, and of course we hope for some outcome of negotiation, but it's hard to see that happening right now. Despite some optimistic words from, I think, the recent visitor from Nigeria, the ally they sent to negotiate, who's offered very diplomatic comments, but not so much of any constructive or realistic or some kind of feedback that would let us believe that there's hope in solving the crisis. So all of us are watching it very closely. We're running towards the end of our time, of 1 hour limit of our show. It's been great to have this discussion. I think we learned a lot. I want to acknowledge the super chats. I'm really grateful for those contributing and giving extra attention and money to the show. We're very excited to have you.
Storm McCollum, always a gentleman.
Very, very, very
Bandiera
polite.
Rosa, Trionfiera. I don't know if that's Spanish, Latin, or Italian. I don't know what language it is.
The red banner will triumph, right?
Some kind of a mix of all the languages. Huh?
Let's say Portuguese.
Okay, well, maybe we can run with Portuguese. So yeah, this was really a wonderful discussion. I'm really grateful to Kuba and Pascal for coming on and for sharing their super smart observations, for picking amazing stories, and for being part of this Masha and the Bears. So I look forward to connecting again in a month's time. We're going to have new topics. And of course, we're always looking for feedback on what we should be covering, what kind of underreported or maybe misreported issues we should be bringing in here. So looking for the feedback both from Kuba and Pascal, but also from all of our viewers. If there's something you want to hear about, learn about, people you want to hear from, I'm excited to bring them here and to engage and debate. Thank you so much and have a good night.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
I just want to say, Maria, you did a wonderful job, and thank you, Pascal and Kuba, for coming on. And usually Djene does this, and I'm doing this here in my new location. And thank you, chat.
Thank you, Noble Brown.
I read something wrong, so I apologize. Jägermeister, I apologize. I'm apologizing to you on air because I want you to know that was my bad. That being said, Maria, I love you like play, cousin. And we have another super chat.
Uh-oh.
Noble Brown says, before you go, thank you all always.
Thank you guys so
Noble
much.
Brown. And by the way, before we go, check out my latest piece in Black Agenda Report. It's hot off the press. It's
Where
a
is it?
barn burner. The title of the piece is "Are Black People the Crash Test Dummies of Democrats?"
Uh-oh. That's a very, very typically controversial title for Pascal.
Yes.
Pascal is going to be on the Ben Dixon show tomorrow. He'll be making the rounds on all the black shows because of this piece.
Cool.
Yeah,
Can
I guess.
Can you share the
He's even going to be on the John McWhorter show.
No, I don't think I'll be on John McWhorter's show.
I'm putting the link in the chat.
Yeah, I want to see the...
I'll put a link to the Pascal's piece in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you guys very much. Again, Maria, lovely.
Thank you for holding the ship, Jason, out of Mexico.
And I do look forward to getting this twice a month.
We'll be working on that. All right.
We got another.
Yeah.
The longer we stay, you get another super chat. It say Oaktown's
left is
best. Oh, you got me missing Oakland right now. Please don't have me miss Oakland. I see too much Dodgers shit out here, so I'm missing Oakland.
You just moved to Mexico. You can't miss it yet. It's too soon.
I mean, it's just
I was gone.
California.
I was in the Central Coast for like 3 months. 2 months. I was in the Central Coast, so I definitely miss Oakland.
It's just like South Oakland there.
Town business. All right, you guys have
where in Mexico are you, by the way? Which
I'm gonna leave for real now. All right, you guys get cartoons. Have a good night.
Right downtown.
All right.